Doctors said she'd never walk again. But one night, stranded in a storm, a mechanic saw her broken wheelchair not as a tragedy, but as a machine he could fix. He promised her freedom. This is the moment he proved it. This is not just a story. It's a piece of someone's hidden pain, quietly waiting to be heard. In today's story, we dive into a moment that can change everything, in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Canada, the US, Norway? Let us know in the comments, because stories may begin anywhere, but they connect us all. Stay with us until the very end, because sometimes what breaks your heart can also heal it. And if you believe stories can change lives, hit subscribe. Join our journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Your voice matters here. A quiet corner of Ohio was where small houses lined the streets, where families lived paycheck to paycheck. Against the windows of a modest 2-bedroom home, a soft rain pattered. Silently by the window in her wheelchair sat 12-year-old Lily, her small hands pressed against the glass as she watched raindrops race each other down. Since the doctors gave their verdict months ago, her once bright spirit had dimmed. A rare spinal condition had stolen her ability to walk, and her chances of recovery, the medical experts said, were nearly non-existent. From her young life hope, it seemed had vanished. Long hours at a diner were worked by her mother Grace, often pulling double shifts just to cover the medical bills. With tired eyes and aching feet, she came home every evening. Yet for Lily, she always tried to smile. Behind that smile, however, was a mother's heartbreak. Buried under the weight of financial struggles and the cruel reality of a daughter confined to a chair. The echoes of doctor visits filled with sterile words like irreversible and limited options were carried by the walls of the house. In silence, Grace often cried, never wanting Lily to see her tears. On one particularly gloomy evening, the rain poured harder than usual. From school, Grace had just picked Lily up and was pushing her old wheelchair down the cracked sidewalk. With every bump, the chair rattled, its rusted wheels squeaking loudly against the wet pavement. One of the wheels jammed completely, suddenly leaving them stranded under the cold rain. Down bent Grace, desperately trying to fix it, her hands shaking as water dripped from her soaked hair. Tightly, Lily clutched her coat, shivering, her small voice breaking. "Mom, what do we do now?" Grace's heart sank. Harder, she pulled at the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. Without stopping, cars passed by, their headlights flashing briefly before disappearing into the dark distance. For Grace, it felt like one more cruel twist of fate. Their broken hopes were symbolized by the broken wheelchair. To herself, she bit her lip, whispering, "Not now. Please, not now." In that fragile moment, completely alone felt Grace, a mother failing her child against the storm. Then through the noise of the rain cut the sound of an old pickup truck slowing to a halt. Against the downpour, a man stepped out, pulling his hood up. He looked about 27, his boots muddy, his jacket worn from long days of labor. Jake was his name, a humble mechanic from the nearby auto shop. A man of wealth or power he wasn't, but his eyes carried something stronger, kindness. Without hesitation, he approached the struggling pair and knelt beside the broken chair. "Need a hand?" he asked gently, his voice calm but steady. Wary of strangers, Grace hesitated, but before she could answer, lower crouched Jake, examining the jammed wheel. Rough were his hands, scarred from years of turning wrenches and lifting heavy parts, yet the way he handled the chair was careful, almost tender. With curiosity, Lily's wide eyes studied him, her heart beating a little faster. For months, no one had stopped for them, and yet here he was in the rain, treating them like they mattered. "This isn't just broken," Jake muttered as he tugged at the mechanism. "To begin with, it was built wrong. Cheap design. No wonder it's giving you trouble." Up he looked, his rain-soaked hair clinging to his forehead. "I can fix this. Better, actually, I can make it." Off guard, Grace straightened, caught by the certainty in his voice. Countless doctors and technicians she had heard say, "Nothing more can be done." Yet no hesitation carried this stranger's words, only determination. Skeptical but curious, she narrowed her eyes. "And what makes you so sure?" On his jeans, Jake wiped his wet hands and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Because my life is machine's engines, gears, wheels. If it runs, I can fix it. But this?" He tapped the wheelchair softly. "For her, this isn't good enough. Something that actually works is what she deserves." For a moment, Grace studied him, searching his face for signs of arrogance or false promises. But instead, she saw sincerity, an honest man who truly believed he could help. Lily, however, didn't need convincing. For the first time in months, her eyes sparkled with hope. "Really?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "You can really make it better." Directly at her looked Jake, not at her mother or the broken chair, but at her. "I promise," he said with quiet confidence. Into a small smile curved Lily's lips, one that Grace hadn't seen in so long. It was fragile, but it was real. Not from medical charts or expensive treatments, but from the hands of a mechanic who refused to see impossible was born a glimmer of hope. Though worry still lingered, Grace's heart softened. Could this man truly give her daughter something no one else could? The rain continued to fall, soaking all three of them, but none seemed to care anymore. Something shift in the air felt Grace, like fate itself had paused to bring them this encounter. Back to his workshop, Jake offered to tow the broken chair, explaining how he could rebuild it. Once more Grace hesitated, but then she looked at Lily, whose small face was glowing with anticipation. With a sigh of surrender, Grace nodded. "All right," she whispered, her voice heavy with both doubt and desperate hope. "We'll trust you." Into his truck, Jake quickly loaded the chair, helping Grace lift Lily gently into the front seat. With fascination, the little girl looked around the cluttered cab, her smile growing as Jake started the engine. For her, it was more than just a ride. It was the first step toward something better. Quietly, Grace sat, her thoughts racing, wondering if this young mechanic was truly capable of changing their lives. That this rainy night was not the end of their struggles, but the beginning of a miracle neither of them had dared to imagine. She didn't know yet. As the truck rumbled toward Jake's workshop, against the window leaned Lily, watching raindrops blur the lights outside. Softly, almost to herself, she whispered, "Mom, maybe things will change now." To look at her daughter turned Grace, startled by the conviction in her voice. For months, only in short, wary words drained of spirit, had Lily spoken. Now her tone carried something new, hope. Grace squeezed her daughter's hand and looked at Jake, who was focused on the road ahead, his jaw set with quiet determination. Deep down, she prayed this man truly could fix more than just a broken chair. By the time they reached the small, dimly lit garage, to a drizzle the rain had slowed. Open, Jake pulled the door and guided them inside, where the smell of oil and metal filled the air. With tools, car parts, and half-finished projects, the place was cluttered, yet it felt strangely alive, filled with the energy of someone who never stopped trying. Onto a workbench, Jake wheeled the chair, studying it like a puzzle waiting to be solved. His every move was followed by Lily's gaze, her excitement bubbling. Still drenched from the rain, Grace watched silently, her heart unsure whether to fear disappointment or believe in a stranger's promise. At both of them, Jake looked with steady eyes. "Give me some time," he said. "I'll make this right." In the air, his words hung simple but powerful. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to breathe without the weight of despair pressing down. Softly, Lily clapped her hands, her laughter echoing through the garage. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and for the first time in months, the storm inside their hearts began to calm as well. Into his workshop, Jake carried the broken wheelchair, his boots echoing against the concrete floor as he set it down on the workbench. Dimly lit was the shop, cluttered with car parts, toolboxes, and the smell of oil and grease that lingered in the air. The task impossible would have been considered by most mechanics, or at least not worth the effort. But most people Jake wasn't. As he stared at the chair, not just broken steel and faulty wheels did he see. He saw a little girl's future. Something inside him refused to treat it as just another repair. Night, after finishing customer cars, behind stayed Jake in his shop. While the town slept, with the sound of welding sparks and grinding metal, the garage buzzed. On scraps of paper, he sketched designs, tore apart motors, and pieced together prototypes that didn't quite fit. Instead of patching up what was broken, to build something entirely new, he decided. An electric wheelchair designed with balance, comfort, and speed in mind. It wasn't about making a machine. It was about giving Lily something no doctor had managed to give her. The first few nights were brutal. Wires sparked, parts jammed, and motors overheated. More than once, aside tossed Jake his gloves in frustration, sweat dripping from his forehead. About quitting, he thought. But then he remembered Lily's eyes, the way they had lit up when he promised her freedom. That memory pulled him back every time, urging him to keep trying. On parts, he spent his savings, scavenged old engines, and customized frames from scratch. Piece by piece, he began shaping what looked less like a chair and more like a miracle in progress. During the evenings to the shop after school, Grace would bring Lily. On a wooden stool in the corner, Lily would sit, swinging her legs, her gaze fixed on Jake's every movement. Small but eager, her voice often filled the quiet garage. "Will it really work, Mr. Jake?" she asked one night, her eyes glowing with cautious hope. Back at her glanced Jake, wiping grease from his hands, and smiled. "Not just work, Lily. It's going to give you freedom." Those words became his fuel. He repeated them to himself whenever doubt crept in. Sometimes tools would be handed to him by Lily, proudly feeling like his little assistant. Other times about the places she dreamed of visiting. If she could move freely again, she would chatter parks, fairs, and even the local ice cream shop downtown. Carefully, Jake listened, storing away every dream as motivation. He wasn't just building a chair. He was building the possibility for those dreams to come true. Grace, meanwhile, stood in the background, her arms crossed, torn between skepticism and cautious admiration. Too many promises broken had she seen, but something about Jake's determination stirred her wary heart. Around the neighborhood, word began to spread about the young mechanic who was trying to build a miracle chair. Some people laughed, calling it a waste of time. Others dismissed it as a desperate attempt to play doctor. He's just a grease monkey. One man scoffed at the diner where Grace worked. What does he know about medicine or wheelchairs? These remarks Grace overheard more times than she could count, but she also knew what they didn't motivated by money or pride. Jake wasn't. From compassion came his determination, and that was something no medical degree could teach. Despite the doubts, some people grew curious. A few neighbors would stop by the shop, peeking through the open garage door to see Jake welding or soldering late into the night. Excitedly, children pointed at the glowing sparks, whispering that he was building something magical. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted, though the skeptics remained loud. Of hope, whispers began to ripple through the community. They hadn't seen anything like this before, a mechanic pouring his soul into creating freedom for a little girl he barely knew. The change, too, Grace noticed. For years, she had spent her trust in doctors, specialists, and expensive treatments, only to be met with disappointment and bills that drowned her family in debt. But different was watching Jake work. He wasn't promising miracles. He was building one with his own hands. A lab coat he didn't wear or speak in medical jargon. In actions he spoke, hours of sweat, cuts on his hands, and sleepless nights spent bending metal into something extraordinary. For the first time began to believe Grace that maybe Lily's story wasn't finished yet. One evening after closing the diner, at the shop arrived Grace to find Jake asleep at his workbench, his head resting on his folded arms, tools scattered around him. Closer tiptoed Lily, giggling softly, then looked back at her mother. Faintly, Grace smiled, her chest tightening with gratitude. For his help, she hadn't asked, yet here he was, sacrificing his time and energy for her daughter. Over his shoulders, Grace quietly draped an old blanket before whispering to Lily, "Let's let him rest. He's doing more for us than anyone ever has." That night, her faith in him grew stronger. As days turned into weeks, the chair began to take shape. No longer did it resemble the old clunky model that had stranded them in the rain. With polished metal, sturdy wheels, and an electric motor Jake had tuned to perfection, this one gleamed. He even added features most wheelchairs didn't have: adjustable seating for comfort, balanced suspension for rough sidewalks, and a control system simple enough for Lily to operate herself. Every bolt, every wire was a silent promise Jake made to her, that she would move forward again. Her excitement Lily couldn't contain as she watched the progress. "It looks amazing," she exclaimed one afternoon, her hands clapping with joy. Grinning, Jake tightened a bolt. "Not amazing yet. Just wait until you try it." Nearby stood Grace, tears welling in her eyes. To see Lily's joy again, she had longed to hear that laugh return. For so long, with silence and worries, their home had been filled, broken only by sighs. Now in every corner of Jake's workshop, the sound of hope echoed. It was fragile, but it was real. The more time Grace spent at the shop, something else about Jake she noticed: his quiet strength. He never boasted about what he was building, never sought recognition. He simply worked, fueled by the simple desire to help. Not only his skills but also his heart found Grace herself admiring. For years, anyone outside of her family she hadn't trusted. But through the walls she had built around herself, Jake's sincerity began breaking. She realized he wasn't just repairing a chair. He was repairing the faith she thought she had lost forever. Of course, challenges still came. Parts would break mid-test, wiring would short-circuit, and sometimes from hours of labor, Jake's hands would bleed. But each time, he shook off the pain and pressed forward. Why he cared so much, Grace once asked him. Why he was willing to go so far for someone he had just met. With steady eyes, Jake looked at her and replied simply, "Because when the world tells you something's impossible, that's when you prove it isn't, and Lily deserves to know what's possible." Deep into Grace's heart, his words sank. As the final days of building drew near, anticipation filled the air. Excitedly, Lily would bounce in her seat every time they visited, begging to know when it would be ready. With a smile, Jake teased her. "Patience, kiddo. The best things take time." Their bond grow. Watched Grace, realizing that more than a machine Jake had given her daughter. He had given her companionship, laughter, and belief in herself again. For Grace, who had spent years carrying the weight of despair, a light she hadn't expected to find had this young mechanic become. By the end of the second month, proudly in the center of the workshop stood the miracle chair, sleek, strong, and beautiful. Unlike anything Grace had ever seen, it looked. The moment she saw it, Lily gasped, her eyes sparkling with awe. From his brow, Jake wiped the sweat and said softly, "This isn't just a chair, Lily. It's your freedom." Her knees weakened, felt Grace as tears streamed down her face. The journey wasn't finished, but in that moment, she knew their lives were already changing. What Jake had built wasn't just metal and wires. It was hope reborn. Weeks later, the long nights of welding, wiring, and sleepless dedication finally reached their purpose. In his workshop stood Jake, staring at what he had built with both pride and disbelief. Under the soft glow of the garage lights, the sleek electric wheelchair gleamed, its polished metal frame and smooth curves nothing like the clunky broken chair that had once carried Lily. For Jake, it wasn't just a machine. It was the result of every promise he had silently made to himself, and to the little girl who had given him a reason to believe in impossible things. At the entrance of the workshop stood Grace, her hands clasped tightly as though she were praying. As she watched Jake roll the chair forward, its electric hum filling the quiet air, her heart pounded. Countless nights she had spent doubting whether this day would ever come. But now that it was here, fear and hope twisted together inside her chest. Would it really work? Could this creation of steel and wires truly succeed where doctors had failed? She could barely breathe as Jake turned toward Lily with a steady smile. With anticipation, Lily's small hands trembled as she wheeled herself closer in her old broken chair. Her eyes widened, reflecting the shine of the new invention before her. To her it looked like more than just a chair. It looked like possibility, freedom, and adventure all woven into one. Down bent Jake, his voice calm but gentle. "Ready to give it a try?" he asked. Eagerly Lily nodded, her lips curling into the brightest smile Grace had seen in months. The moment felt like the edge of a miracle waiting to unfold. With careful hands, into the new chair Jake helped Lily. Behind stood Grace, biting her lip as she steadied her daughter. Perfectly to Lily's small frame the seat molded, its soft padding offering comfort she had never known in her old chair. The controls adjusted Jake, his fingers moving confidently, then stepped back to let her hold the joystick. Over the garage fell a hush, the air heavy with anticipation. That this was more than a test was known by all three of them. It was a turning point. Forward on the control pressed Lily's finger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a smooth hum, across the floor glided the chair, rolling forward as though it had been waiting for her all along. Lily gasped, her voice breaking into a joyous laugh that filled every corner of the workshop. She turned the chair, spinning in a small circle, then pushed it faster, her hair flying as the chair obeyed her every command. It was freedom wrapped in motion, and she reveled in it. Instantly Grace's tears fell, rolling down her cheeks as she covered her mouth. Her eyes she couldn't believe. Her daughter, who had spent months bound by pain and limitation, was now moving with ease, joy radiating from her face. "You gave her what doctors couldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. Quietly stood Jake, wiping the grease from his hands, humbled by the moment. "Sometimes," he replied softly. "Hope just needs a different kind of mechanic." In the air like a truth carved from steel, his words hung. As around the workshop zipped Lily, laughter bubbling from her chest, Grace's heart swelled. Of all the nights she had cried, she thought, of the endless hospital visits and cold pronouncements from doctors. For so long with despair, life had been filled. But now, in this dimly lit garage, the impossible made real she saw. Forward she rushed, hugging Jake tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. "You don't know what you've done for us," she whispered. Gently, Jake returned the embrace, still not fully grasping the magnitude of his gift. For Lily, it was as if the world had opened its doors again. Outside, she rode the chair, the cool evening air brushing against her cheeks. Above, the stars glittered as smoothly over the sidewalk glided the chair, handling every bump with ease. "Mom, look, I can go anywhere," she shouted, her voice echoing with joy. Close behind followed Grace, watching in awe as her daughter navigated the world with newfound independence. A declaration that her life had changed forever was every push of the joystick. From their homes, neighbors peeked out, curious about the laughter ringing through the night. Down the street in the shining chair, they saw Lily darting, her joy impossible to ignore. Some stood stunned, whispering among themselves about the miracle unfolding before them. Only weeks ago, many had doubted Jake, mocking his efforts. But now those same voices were silenced, replaced with admiration and awe. What experts couldn't, the humble mechanic had done. He had given a child her freedom back. From the garage doorway, Jake watched inside, his arms crossed as a faint smile tugged at his lips. Cars that roared across highways he had built, engines that carried families across states he had fixed. But nothing compared to this moment. For once, about machines wasn't his work. It was about lives. And though he had never sought recognition, he knew this was the kind of accomplishment that would stay with him forever. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human. As the night grew quiet again, back inside guided Grace Lily. From excitement, Lily's cheeks were flushed, her eyes still sparkling with delight. "Thank you, Mr. Jake," she said, her voice full of sincerity far beyond her years. Down beside her knelt Jake, meeting her gaze. "Don't thank me, Lily. You're the one with the courage. I just built the chair. You made it fly." At his words, Lily giggled, her laughter a melody that wrapped around all three of them, binding them together in a way none of them expected. From that day on, Lily's life transformed. The mornings she no longer dreaded or sat silently by the window. Instead, she explored her neighborhood, visited the park, and even joined her friends at school events she had once been forced to miss. Accessible to her became every corner of the town. Within reach became every dream. Often behind followed Grace, tears glistening in her eyes as she watched her daughter reclaim the childhood she had been denied. The chair wasn't just a machine. It was a second chance. Jake found his life subtly changing. Not for car repairs, but to shake his hand, to thank him for what he had done. People began to stop by the shop. Some called him a genius, others a miracle worker. But always Jake shrugged, insisting he was just a mechanic who didn't know when to give up. Deep down, though, he knew the truth. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about keeping a promise to a little girl who deserved better. That was all the reward he needed. One afternoon, as through the park watched Grace Lily glide effortlessly, with tears in her eyes, she turned to Jake. "You've done more for us than anyone else ever has," she said softly. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Firmly, Jake shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Seeing her smile, he said, "That's enough." With gratitude, Grace felt her heart swell, realizing that kindness like his was rare in the world. He hadn't just fixed a wheelchair. He had restored their faith in humanity. The story of Jake and Lily soon spread beyond the neighborhood. Across town, people began talking about the mechanic who had built hope from scrap metal. At the garage, local reporters showed up, eager to share the story of the man who had given a little girl her freedom. The spotlight Jake tried to avoid, but to let the story be told encouraged Grace. "Maybe," she said, "it will inspire others to believe in what's possible." Reluctantly, Jake agreed, though he remained humble, never claiming more credit than he deserved. Through it all, one truth remained clear: no longer just a girl bound to a chair was Lily. She was a child with freedom dreams, and a future waiting for her. Once filled with silence and despair, Grace's home now overflowed with laughter, hope, and gratitude. And Jake, once just a poor mechanic in a small town, had unknowingly become the hero of their story. That miracles don't always come from hospitals or doctors, he had proven. Sometimes they come from ordinary people with extraordinary hearts.